Questions? The honourable member for Scarborough Southwest.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's nice to finally see the minister up on his feet on this bill, even though it didn't actually happen until after time allocation was introduced. You would think that the minister would have cared enough about this bill to be the one to introduce it, but so far we've only had about 10 minutes of debate on this bill, and it was frankly a disgraceful speech given by the member for Simcoe Grey, who couldn't stop laughing during her speech, and it happened after midnight. And so, of course, we didn't really get much information here, and the minister has yet to actually get up and give a proper speech in the House of Commons defending this bill and why it's important for the government to pass it. We have several motions or several parts of this bill which deal with the anti-counterfeiting trade agreement, which raises serious concerns, and Europe has said no to that, and the government's implementing some of those motions in this bill. And, of course, the numbers that the minister mentioned, in terms of the numbers going from 7 billion to 38, of course, those are anecdotal. We've been calling for years for there to actually be more stronger reporting measures to actually capture how much is being lost to counterfeiting, and the government has yet to take any actions on that, nor has it put any in the bill to strengthen the data that we're going to receive. So I'd like to ask the minister why he didn't feel it was important enough to get up and give a full speech on this bill before time allocation was brought on it.
The honourable minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, I must remind my colleague that our government's bill is a Made Canada solution that draws from international best practices. What he raises from Europe is just not relevant here. We addressed the issue here. He knows exactly that the concerns that were raised in Europe are not part of this bill here. Second, Mr. Speaker, as I said, all of the party supported this bill in committee back in 2007. So I don't know why he tries to slow the things down when we know that this is desperately needed. And I'm very happy that the member from Simcoe Grey stood up in this House, given her knowledge and her skills, and saying that we have to take care of the health and safety of the Canadians, and this is shameful that he can just try to disqualify the member from Simcoe York. She had a good speech, Mr. Speaker, and the words that he used are just shameful, Mr. Speaker. We have to make sure, Mr. Speaker, that we take care about health and safety of the Canadians, and we won't excuse for that, Mr. Speaker.
Scarborough Southwest.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And here we are again debating another bill that was put under time allocation. The irony in this instance, Mr. Speaker, I mean, we're at 44 or 45 times now. The irony in this instance is that this is actually a situation where if the government could have had an agreement with the opposition to actually speed the debate of this bill so that we would in fact be using less of the House's time than it took to bring in a time allocation motion, vote on a time allocation motion, and then provide a full day of debate, because we in the NDP do want to see this bill go back to committee where it can be approved, so we will be supporting it at second reading. But again, Mr. Speaker, we had time allocation brought in before the Minister for Industry, the person presenting the bill, had even spoken to the bill. We had not even had one full speech in this House, a speech by the member for Simcoe Grey, where she spent half of her speech laughing at jokes being told to her by other caucus members. So we didn't even have one full speech before time allocation was brought in. And, Mr. Speaker, I say humbly that this is not democracy. This is not how Parliament is supposed to work. We are supposed to have the opportunity to have fulsome debates in this House on the various issues that are brought forward. And C-56 is an important issue. So, Mr. Speaker, it's an act to amend the Copyright and Trademarks Act and to make consequential amendments to other acts, which is otherwise titled the now Combating Counterfeit Products Act. It's my honour to rise today to present the lead-off speech on Bill C-56 for the NDP and the official opposition. Normally, our industry critic, the member for La Salle-Mort, would be leading us off on second reading comments on this bill, and our critic had planned to give herself remarks on Friday when this bill was supposed to come up for debate. However, of course, again, because of time allocation and the government playing games, we're here Wednesday evening instead of Friday, again preventing certain members of Parliament from participating in this debate in the way that they would like to. So, Mr. Speaker, in their rush to introduce yet more record-breaking time allocation motions, and as I said, we're at 46 now in this House. The Conservatives rescheduled all the House business this week, and as the NDP's deputy industry critic, it is indeed my privilege to address this bill on behalf of the official opposition. This is a bill the NDP takes very seriously, as opposed to, as I mentioned, it would appear the Conservative government, because this bill was presented originally in March, didn't come up for debate until the end of May. And, Mr. Speaker, recommendations for this bill were made in a committee report in 2007, they were made in 2009, and then again more recommendations from the Industry Committee in an intellectual property study that was done earlier this year. And it's taken the government a really long time to start bringing these forward for implementation. So, of course, Mr. Speaker, we have yet to have a full speech by the Minister for Industry on this bill. What we have had, and even then, if it wasn't going to be the Minister, you would think maybe the Parliamentary Secretary, the member for Edmonton Mills, Woods Beaumont, but no. Yes, we do in fact have me giving a full speech on this bill, but Mr. Speaker, when the government presents a bill, the government is supposed to justify why they're bringing that bill forward. They have yet to do that and have already implemented time allocation. So I thank the member for Pickering-Ajax for his interjection there. Ajax-Pickering. They're both one in the... Well, Mr. Speaker. So instead, what we had was the Parliamentary Secretary for Human Resources and Skills Development getting up and presenting a very short speech on this bill, where, as I said before, she spent a lot of the time laughing, and it didn't seem to be taking the bill seriously. It was so bad, in fact, that the Speaker had to interrupt and ask if she was able to continue. Now, I mention all this because it seems to speak to the Conservative government's, again, contempt for Parliament, and to their continual practice of introducing legislation that could never be properly implemented because their budget cuts make it impossible. There are many cliches we would use, Mr. Speaker, but the Conservatives keep putting forth pieces of legislation that are either empty shells or just cherry-picked from among the many recommendations that we need to implement to have solid pieces of legislation. Rules and regulations that perhaps can't be enforced because of those budget cuts, because they might mean that no one is there to enforce them. Recent examples include, Mr. Speaker, Bill C-51, the Witness Protection Act, which the Conservatives put forward without the funding in place to make many of its provisions actually meaningful. And another bill, C-54, which makes changes on how we deal with people deemed not criminally responsible. However, it downloads responsibility for the mental health care onto the very provinces that are having their health care budgets slashed, again, by this Conservative government. And, Mr. Speaker, Bill C-56 is another example of the Conservatives playing the shell game they so like to play. Legislation that on the one hand imposes some good rules, and on the other hand, through the budget, cuts jobs of those that are supposed to be enforcing these new rules. This bill gives ex officio powers to our border officers, which the NDP has been calling for since 2007. However, it's very difficult to see how this will be implemented when last year the Conservatives slashed $143 million in funding to CBSA, which further reduced frontline officers and harmed our ability to monitor our borders. CBSA expects to lose several hundred frontline officers by 2015. It's also important to note that the government has, in the past, refused repeatedly to take a balanced approach to copyright. At committee, we had many different Canadian businesses and organizations come in to present before the committee, and one such company was Canada Goose, which is certainly a Canadian success story. And Canada Goose brought with them some counterfeit Canada Goose jackets that they had collected. And, Mr. Speaker, the things contained within these counterfeit jackets would make your toes curl. Things like there being feces in the lining, that feathers were not being properly treated and sanitized before being stuffed in the jackets, and certainly they weren't goose down. They weren't coyote fur. Many different animals were being used, and it's very unfortunate to see just how difficult it was, though, on the surface to detect these jackets as being counterfeit, because when you put a real jacket next to a counterfeit jacket, they looked identical. It wasn't until you would actually take a microscope to it or start pulling the jacket apart that you would actually start to see that one of these jackets was indeed counterfeit. Another organization that came before us was Hockey Canada. And they were talking about the last Olympics we had here in Canada and about professional sports jerseys. And professional sports jerseys, they've been finding through studies that they've conducted and at the Olympics that sometimes in professional sporting events, up to 70 to 75% of the actual jerseys that were being worn at these games were indeed counterfeit. So consumers themselves are unwittingly buying illegal and counterfeit products when they're trying to support their sports teams. At the Olympics in Vancouver, there were many stops and arrests made of individuals selling counterfeit goods of Olympic paraphernalia and products. And it is a growing problem, Mr. Speaker, because New Democrats on the committee, which I'm a member, filed a dissenting opinion which called on the government also to consult with consumer groups as well as industry groups in an effort to combat counterfeiting and piracy, and called for border officials to receive appropriate authority to do their work while respecting civil liberties and due process, and for the CBSA to be adequately funded to combat counterfeiting without compromising its other important responsibilities to protect Canadians and defend our border.
Member for Halifax West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I enjoyed hearing from my speech of my honourable colleague from Scarborough Southwest, with whom I sit on the Industry Committee of the House, and where we've heard some of the things that he's talked about. One of the things he didn't mention was airbags. And some testimony we've had, it suggested, in fact, that there are counterfeit airbags that come into Canada, and sometimes those airbags underinflate and don't do anything to protect the person, and sometimes they can be so heavily inflated that there's too much pressure. I mean, so that when they actually are activated, the label on the steering wheel actually can pierce a person's heart, as they've proven with tests, thankfully not with real people, obviously. But so that's an example of the kind of danger, the hazard that these products that come into Canada can present to Canadians. So I want to ask my colleague not only about whether he thinks we need to have an education process in addition to this bill to educate Canadians, but also is he concerned about the fact that the government with this bill would allow goods to arrive in Canada and then be shipped to the U.S., for example, or to another country without being stopped or examined in the way that this bill suggests.
The honourable member for Scarborough Southwest.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my good friend on the Industry Committee for his hard work on the committee as well. And he brought up, of course, airbags, which is a health and safety issue. Of course, when a car gets into an accident and airbags deploy, it's to keep people safe. So it really does demonstrate the challenges that exist potentially for border officials to actually monitor and track what's coming into the country. Certainly any good that's coming into Canada should be subject to a potential inspection and seizure, because we don't want to be unwittingly as a country contributing to problems that are going to happen in other countries because of counterfeit goods. Not only does the public need education, Mr. Speaker, but if we are giving these new powers to border officials in order to be able to seize these goods, they have to be able to identify them. They have to be able to run tests, for instance, on airbags or other products. We have heard some really, of course, troubling stories in the United States where military procurement has been impacted by counterfeit goods that are ending up in military planes, even in civilian planes and other areas. You know, these counterfeit goods could have catastrophic impacts and loss of human life. And certainly we do not want to be receiving those goods, nor do we want to be receiving those goods and then shipping them elsewhere. So yes, Mr. Speaker, we should certainly be looking at all the goods that cross into our borders, whether they're leaving here or not.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. The honourable member for Timmins James Bay.
Mr. Speaker, I listened with great interest to my honourable colleague, particularly where he referenced the U.S. 301 watch list that and their comments that are being put on Canada and our trade policies and our counterfeit policies. I'm interested in this because in 2009, a special advisor to the now Treasury Board President, Zoe Addington, met with U.S. officials, and according to their notes, she said that in the contrast to messages from other Canadian officials, if Canada is elevated to the special 301 priority watch list, it will help the Government of Canada's ability to enact copyright legislation. So what that cable tells us is that the present Treasury Board President had his officials in Washington saying, put Canada on the most notorious watch list, along with outlying countries like Yemen and North Korea, for being considered basically bandit country, undermining our trade interests because they thought it would help pursue an agenda in Parliament. And I find that absolutely shocking. The Computer and Communications Industry Association in the United States, who represents the largest software organizations in the world, actually went to Washington on Canada's behalf. We didn't have any support from this government, who were actually undermining our trade interests, to say that the use of the special 301 provision unrelated to the adequate and effective protection of relevant rights delegitimizes the 301 process because they're using it for policy ends. And said that it was completely unacceptable that they were targeting Canada, and said that in many respects Canada's laws are more protective of creators than the United States. This was before our present copyright bill came in. So I'd like to ask my honourable colleague, how can you take a government seriously that would actually undermine our trade reputation internationally and say to our largest trading partner, put us on an outlier list along with North Korea and Yemen because it'll help us pursue a copyright agenda? I find it shocking that they would undermine our trade interests like this.
The honourable member for Scarborough Southwest.
Well, once again, we have what I guess I would call an instance of policy-based evidence, where the government went and actually sought to gain evidence or create evidence in order to justify a potential policy. Another way of saying it in this instance would be they tried to create a crisis so that they could ride in and fix it. Now, where have we seen that kind of strategy before, Mr. Speaker? We saw it with John Snowballin, a former education minister in the Mike Harris government in Ontario. And of course, who were main components of that same government? The current Treasury Board Chair, the current Minister for Foreign Affairs, and the current Finance Minister. They were all integral to that strategy of creating crises and then riding in to try to fix them. And again, we have an instance where they actually sought to have us put on this list so that they could then justify policies that were being brought forward. But what's absolutely ridiculous about this was that was in 2009. In 2007, there was an industry committee report, and there were recommendations made. They could have moved forward then. And we had all-party agreements on many of the aspects. A bill could have been brought forward then, years before this happened, which again shows the ridiculous nature of sometimes the things that this government does, just like imposing time allocation on this bill. We could have had an agreement that could have saw us fast-track this bill, but instead the government comes down again with time allocation. They waste an hour on that, and then now we're going to spend the whole day, next day debating this bill, when we could have, in fact, have reached an agreement and moved on quicker, Mr. Speaker, so that this bill can get back to committee, where myself and the Liberal member who spoke earlier and the other members of the committee can actually study the bill and come forward with more recommendations.
Question et commentaires, questions and comments? Honourable Deputy de
The honourable
Sherbrooke.
member for Sherbrooke. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank my colleague for his excellent speech tonight. He's well informed, and we can see that he's working very carefully on the Industry Committee. I wanted to raise a point that he mentioned, and I'd like to hear a bit more about it, and it's the fact that we are against counterfeit products, and we have to find ways to counter them, but we have to also ensure that the Canada Border Services Agency has the resources to find these products and make sure that they don't come across the border. They have to be able to see them before they can determine whether or not they are counterfeit products or not. So can he expand on that a little bit and talk about the means that the CBSA has at its disposal to really work on this problem?
The honourable member for Scarborough Southwest.
Merci, et j'aimerais
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank my colleague for the question. And certainly, if we're going to give more responsibility to border services, we have to ensure that there aren't cutbacks in that area. Right now, there's $143 million in cutbacks that were imposed on them in the last budget, and even the CBSA is saying that they're going to lose 560 full-time jobs. So how can we give them more responsibilities, more education, and give them more to do at the same time? If they are 546, in fact, fewer, we have a huge territory in this country. There are many crossings. There are ports as well that are expanding, so we need more resources, not fewer, to ensure that they can do the job that they have to do now. If we're giving them even more to do, we have to give them more resources. It costs money to keep our country safe.